How does prophecy, Catholic and Orthodox, relate to the recent bombing of Iran? Let's begin in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. There are several prophecies that are involved with these events, and we explored some prophecies leading up to this and these events recently in other programs that were published on my channel. I'd like to start off with a Catholic prophecy, and this is by Marie Julie Jahenny. A great explosion will occur in Persia. And for those not familiar with Marie Julie Jahenny, she's a French mystic of the 19th century. So this is a prophecy from the 1800s. Now, she was also a stigmatist, so she shared in the sufferings of our Lord's holy wounds. And her messages, they were approved by a local French bishop. Now, she also, besides saying this, she was relating this to events that would occur afterwards. So this is an important event that has just occurred. And when she talked about Persia, again, this is someone from the 1800s, she's referring to what is today known as Iran. Also, back at her time, a great explosion is not a nuclear explosion. Nuclear explosions were not known at that time. There is no understanding of the capabilities that exist today regarding warfare or anything that involves nuclear reactors or bombs. And in this case, it's a reference to what has recently happened on June 13th, 2025, an explosion that was aimed at the nuclear reactor of Iran. And because of that, caused a humanitarian crisis, because we now have radioactivity that's dissipating from that attack. Now, I want to relate this to a more recent prophecy coming from the Eastern Orthodox Church. And this is from an ascetic and elder of the church, Elder Theodoros of Crete, who passed away in 2016. So this is a very recent prophecy, and it sounds very familiar. And I'm going to read this short passage from the Elder Theodoros. You will be drinking your coffee, and you will hear that Israel attacked the nuclear program of Persia, Iran. That's when events of greater magnitude will begin. And at the same time, or a little earlier, Erdogan will fall. These will be the signs of the big events to come. So you understand that they are near at the door. And this is also another prophecy that ties together, because he's mentioning Erdogan of Turkey, currently the president of Turkey, and he's according to the current term, to be president of Turkey until 2028. However, there's some discord in Turkey, where we have the opposition party was recently arrested by the Erdogan government. And this is also a prophecy that is tied together with another Orthodox prophecy. And of course, the Eastern Orthodox are very attuned to this area because that's where they reside for the most part. So they're very interested in what occurs in Turkey, also in the Middle East. There is a prophecy by Saint Paisios, and he had a prophecy that Erdogan would fall, and then there would be war World War III would break out between Russia and Turkey. And you see the current relationship between Erdogan and Russia and NATO. He's very much a pragmatist. He's very much someone who wishes to work both sides of the fence for the purposes of his people in Turkey. And he does a lot of work with Russia. So it's unlikely that you would see Erdogan do anything that would instigate Russia to the point where they would attack Turkey. So when Erdogan falls, it seems that Erdogan will be replaced by a government that is vehemently anti-Russian and perhaps shares the same view of some of the instigators of war in the West, where they are very interested in the resources of Russia and breaking Russia up into different pieces so that they can have their way with the resources and eliminate them as a competitor. So what we're looking at today is we're looking at the very near possibility that Erdogan is replaced. And that's actually the words that were used by St. Paisios, that he would be replaced. And it was unclear whether he would be overthrown or he would be voted out or his term would complete. So I'd like to point to that and say that because of that, because of what just happened, that Iran is being eliminated as a threat, although I believe that the last has not been heard regarding this war between Israel and Iran. And it seems like the decapitation plot against Iran and the attack was very successful from the Israeli perspective. I do not believe this is the last that will be heard from it. However, if you take a look at it from the Israeli perspective, and I'm going to point to Netanyahu because I believe he's somewhat compromised from his view. In other words, I don't believe he's working in the interest of Israel. He's working in the interest of himself because he has legal problems there. And what he's attempting to do is to vacillate from one war to another, tap the Israelis along and Israel's allies from one war to another to maintain his own power and to avoid his own legal problems. So I don't believe he has the Israeli interest in mind. As a matter of fact, all my life I've been supportive of Israel and their rights to exist, their right to live in Israel and to defend themselves there. But I do not support Netanyahu. I view him as someone who was very dangerous both to the Israelis, to his neighbors, and to his allies. So if you look at it from his perspective, Netanyahu's perspective, he's eliminated, for the most part, or greatly decreased the ability of his enemies that are nearby to inflict damage. And he's also decreased his ability to establish a pretext for war against them in the sense that they are greatly decreased in their capabilities. If he looks around himself and says, who is my next target? Well, it's not going to be Jordan. Jordan actually helped shoot down Iranian missiles. It's not going to be Egypt. Egypt is staying out of it. And they would not take Palestinian refugees because they very wisely decided that we do not want Hamas in Egypt And they know that that could open them up to attack by Israel because they don't want to be perceived as a base for Hamas. So Syria has already been another one that has been greatly diminished. The Syrian government, Assad, is no more. I want to talk about that a little bit more and why that matters. But right now I want to go back to what's the next target? What's the next target for Netanyahu? How can he keep the ball of war rolling? Well, the next target could be Turkey because of their involvement in Syria, although that involvement, I believe, greatly helped Israel. There's been vocalizations coming out of the Turkish government, especially Erdogan, regarding how they are against Israel, regarding their attack on Palestinians in Gaza, and also now the attack on Iran. However, they've just been vocalizations, and they're more geared for internal consumption, I believe, because also the population of Turkey is greatly against those attacks as well. So I believe Erdogan, again, I kind of referenced him as a fence sitter. So he's sitting on the fence and he's providing lip service against these attacks, but he's not really doing anything. However, perhaps that is sufficient pretext for Netanyahu to consider Turkey as the next target. Turkey is a very large country. Well, so was Iran. And Turkey has a very large military and is part of NATO. So what kind of an attack would it be on Turkey? Well, it could be regime change, decapitation, perhaps. So we will see. And according to the elder Theodoros, we will see soon. And at minimum, we will see by the end of the term that Erdogan has in 2028. And so I'd like to maybe do something I don't normally do. I want to make a reference. I have a lot of Orthodox followers of my channel. And it's very unusual for a Catholic to have many Orthodox followers. And I'm not 100% sure why. I know that perhaps they see that I respect the prophecies of the Orthodox saints. And Catholics have criticized me for discussing the Orthodox saints and their prophecies. And the Orthodox have been appreciative of that. Well, I do so because these prophecies from the Orthodox saints, like from the Catholic saints, have come true. And I like to point out the commonality that we have between the Orthodox and the Catholic. So I just seen recently, it was an article by Protestants, and they talked about this tree of Christianity, is the way it was termed, and that Protestantism is one branch, Orthodox is another branch, and Catholicism is another branch. And that, of course, is very wrong. When I look at the Orthodox and the Catholics, I see so much in common regarding our faith, and so little difference that we quarrel about. And I kind of look at ourselves like we're both two brothers. We're two brothers. We're arguing about seats at the dinner table. But these brothers remain brothers, and they have so much that bind them together. So looking at this idea of the three branches, it is wrong because the Orthodox and the Catholics, they share a great deal in common regarding the faith and their beliefs. The sacraments, we both share the apostolic succession of our bishops going back to the apostles. We have 7 sacraments, and because of that apostolic succession, we have valid priests. And we, in fact, we are the tree together. Together, we represent the tree. We represent the trunk. We represent the roots going back to Christ. And it is this commonality that binds us together, because this bond, the bond of faith, is greater than the bond of blood. I want to go to another prophecy, and this comes from an apparition of our Blessed Mother at Fatima, which most people are very familiar with. They're familiar with the dancing, miraculous sun, where tens of thousands of people witnessed this great miracle in Fatima, Portugal, in 1917. The reason why it's relevant is this attack on Persia, or Iran, on a nuclear reactor of Iran that was prophesied. It occurred on June 13th, 2025, as I mentioned. June 13th is significant at Fatima. On June 13th, 1917, our Blessed Mother came to the 3 children of Fatima and brought with her a message about the rosary, how important it is to say the rosary, the prayers of the rosary. Later, in 1929, again, June 13th, and this may be even more significant. So this was 96 years ago, prior to the attack. Our Blessed Mother came and asked for the consecration of Russia. Now, why is that important? That is important because of what I just mentioned regarding Russia. World War III will start with this attack we've just witnessed, the fall of Erdogan, or his replacement, I should say, and a later war between Turkey and Russia. Does that sound far-fetched? The war between Turkey and Russia? Well, the West and its designs against Russia are proving to be a failure. It's not working. The war against them is not working. The sanctions are not working at all. As a matter of fact, they're backfiring against those who are providing the sanctions. So the next step is to mitigate the power that Russia has. Now, Russia has access to the West, the Western Ocean ways, via the Baltic and also via the Black Sea. Well, the Baltic is surrounded by countries belonging to NATO. It's a very narrow passage. The Black Sea can be exited and entered through the Bosphorus Straits of Turkey, a very narrow passageway. If Turkey were to turn against Russia, deny them access, either leaving or going to the Black Sea, then this could be an act of war. And also, of course, Turkey is on the Black Sea itself. This, I believe, is going to be the next target of the neocons of the West, the warmongers of the West. And I'm probably being generous by just calling them neocons and warmongers, perhaps more generous than they deserve. But let me read you the message coming from our Blessed Mother at Fatima on June 13th, 1929, 96 years ago, about Russia. And I quote, "The moment has come in which God asked the Holy Father to make and to order that in union with him and at the same time, all the bishops of the world make the consecration of Russia to my Immaculate Heart, promising to convert it because of this day of prayer and worldwide reparation. So this was actually performed by Pope Francis in 2022, March 25th, after the breakout of war between Ukraine and Russia, and it was requested by the Ukrainian bishops for him to do so. It was also performed in 1884 by Pope John Paul II. And it was 7 years after that the dissolution of the Soviet Union occurred. I expect something similar to occur 7 years after the Pope Francis consecration, or around that time. But I don't expect the dissolution of Russia. And I don't want to get into what I do expect there, but I expect it again to be a situation that backfires. And if indeed it is this war, it is going to be a war where everyone loses. There cannot be a winner in a nuclear war. They're not going to be able to decapitate Russia or destroy all its nuclear assets internally. That's not going to be possible. And the very act of that would initiate a nuclear war, which we would not win. And no one would win. So I talked about Russia. Why is Russia important? Well, I want to use the example of just what happened in Syria. So there were this group of mercenaries put together, mostly by Turkey, in northern Syria along the Turkish border, with the assistance of the United States, Israel, and, believe it or not, Ukraine, because they wanted to leverage Ukrainian capabilities with drones. And Israel perhaps was not a direct participant in it, but they definitely knew about it. And I don't want to get into all the details of this, but you can look at a previous program that I had, and we discussed the recent events that occurred quite a bit regarding Syria. Syria is important because of the timing of it. The timing of the attack. I want to talk about the attack also a little bit more against Iran. But the timing of the Syrian attack happened towards the end of 2024. And the reason why that is important, and the timing is important, it's prior to the new administration in the United States coming to power in January of 2025. And I believe it was a trap. It was a trap for the new administration to immerse the new administration in war and to distract them, to make them weak, and have them less effective with their internal agenda in the United States. And we can see the agenda in the United States playing out right now, and it was very much contrary to the globalist agenda, which the previous administration in the United States was a puppet to. So in Syria, one of the things that puzzled many was why did Assad and his army just seem to give up? I think that the expectation, like I mentioned, there would be a long, drawn-out war there in Syria, but that didn't happen. Instead, the army was given orders by the government in Damascus to stand down, and they just let these mercenaries, which were a rather small number, 30,000, very small compared to the Syrian government, they just let them come. And even at Damascus, they were told to stand down and to not fight these mercenaries. And the government of Assad abandoned Syria Where did he abandon Syria to go to? Moscow. So at first I thought that, well, Assad was being bought off. There's a lot of money going to Ukraine. If the Ukrainians were involved, it would be very easy for them to funnel some of those funds that they were receiving over to Assad. And maybe that's true. Maybe that did happen. However, the other part that I think happened is I believe that the Russians understood what was going on, that it was a trap for the United States, the new administration, in other words, and it was also a trap for the Russians. And they worked this out, that Assad was going to go to Moscow and that they would not fight. And who did that hurt? And that hurt Hezbollah. They were currently fighting with Israel because the Iranians were using Syria as a pathway to send arms into Lebanon to help Hezbollah. But I believe that's what's happening there. And again, Russia appears to be a main player in this. It seems to be a focal point for events that are occurring, or in this case, not occurring. So what does Russia have to do with any of this? Well, Russia is also an ally of Iran. And I'm wondering how long they will look at the bombardment of Iran, the regime change, which I believe is desired there. And one thing I want to say is I mentioned the neocons and their desire to hem Russia in. Well, Russia has a goal of building a roadway down towards Iran. And if they have a government which is hostile to them, then that roadway may be not feasible going forward. And also, it's been a neocon dream for a long, long time to attack Iran. And the dream went something like this. First, we would attack Libya, which has happened, and then Iraq, which has happened, and then Iran, which has now happened. So this talk about, well, we don't want them to have a nuclear weapon. Well, they didn't have a nuclear weapon, did they? It reminds me a lot of the propaganda heard back when George Bush was president, and we heard a great deal of propaganda from the many different horns of the state media, where they were all in unison talking about the weapons of mass destruction, the ones that never existed, the ones that proved to be a lie, that were supposed to be in Iraq. And of course, they were never found. Now, I know I'm going back in history a bit for some people that may not remember this, but in the United States, 99 out of 100 senators voted to go to war against Iraq. And we talk about funding, and we talk about money coming from Ukraine and going to different people, like perhaps Assad, maybe. And we just know that President Fico from Slovakia, he mentioned that he received a bribe from Ukraine. And he announced it. Well, how many people receive a bribe and just take the money and do what they're asked to do? I suspect that that's many people that do that. And I look at like some people that go to Ukraine. Are they going to Ukraine because they're presidents or they're senators or they're MPs? Are they going to Ukraine because they're showing support for Ukraine? or are they selling their support? And here's a recent example. Two senators from the United States, both from different parties, they look like they just received a bicycle for Christmas, and they're 8 years old. They're so happy to be there. So the timing of it also is very interesting, because a day before that, the Ukrainians, they launched an attack inside of Russia, an attack against the nuclear bombers that they have in Russia. And I believe it was 3 different bases that they attacked. And what I want to point out here is that there's a great similarity between the attacks that were launched against the Russian nuclear bombers and the internal attack launched by Israel. Now, am I trying to say that the Israeli attack against Iran and the attack of Ukraine against Russia, that were both internal? Am I trying to say that they were both architected by Israel? No, I'm not trying to say that. But there is a similarity that is not a coincidence. Also, the timing. The timing is very revealing. So these two senators that I just showed, they went to Ukraine, perhaps selling their support, and also to gloat because they knew the attack was coming. It's no coincidence they were there the day before. Absolutely none. Also, the timing between the attack in Russia and the attack on Iran is no coincidence. And the reason being is that the attack in Iran was greatly dependent upon people being where they were expected to be. And if the Iranians got the idea that they too could be attacked internally, they could move from where they were expected to be, and the attack would fail. So the attack against Iran, the internal attack against Iran, where they used what was initially reported as missiles, short-range missiles, and drones, that needed to occur quickly. And that is, I think, another reason why there was a great desire to make a decision there. I want to talk a little bit again about the timing. This was planned. This internal attack on Iran was planned a long time ago, and perhaps was started after October 7th, 2023, the attack of Hamas against Israel. So that means that this was known for a long time, planned for a long time, and I believe it was going to occur regardless of what transpired with the negotiations that were being held regarding nuclear weapons. And I want to point out also this negotiation. First, the demand was Iran cannot have any nuclear weapons. Then it was, well, they can't have any nuclear enrichment. So it seemed like they kept lowering the bar. They kept moving the goalposts, as they say in the United States. So it seemed like they become more stringent with their demands. And I believe that occurred because they wanted to launch this attack. And they wanted to do it quickly. So the neocons got their way. It's like a neocon Christmas. They're getting everything they wish for. They're getting all the wars that they desire. Except perhaps one. Perhaps they want a greater war with Russia. And that may soon come. So why do they want war? Well, there's a number of reasons why they want war. And first, there's a domestic one. They need to distract from their own failings. So if you're in Germany and you're losing your industrial capacity because of your own policies, and you're having your nation invaded by foreign nationals who are coming unvetted illegally, and you're not doing anything to stop it, and perhaps you want to distract, and you want to point towards a common enemy, common with other nations. Is it a real enemy? Doesn't matter if it's a real enemy. They just need this red herring, this faux enemy. It doesn't really matter if Russia wishes to invade Europe or not. They're going to be the enemy. And one thing people don't know, most people don't know this, because I think that many in the West are ashamed to say it. But Russia once asked to be part of NATO. And that might be a shock to people, but they did ask for that. And they were told flat no. So what's happened with the policies of using Russia as this boogeyman? The policy has been very detrimental to the Western interest. It's pushed Russia and China together. And it's pushed them together in a manner where they're going to be together in their interest for decades. And there's little that can be done about it. They're both nuclear powers. They're both very large, have extremely large armies, sophisticated weaponry, which is only growing. And we've done this to ourselves in the West. There's a number of reasons why that's happened. I mean, there's mostly incompetence, but there's also self-interest, where there's people that were in our government who really had no interest regarding whether they were benefiting the citizenry or not. And you can see that still today in many nations. So these policies, besides pushing Russia and China together, they've had effects upon these nations, such as England and France and Germany, which I mentioned. They've decreased economic activity. They're all close to being in a recession. They've depleted their arms by sending them over to Ukraine. They can't produce them as fast as Ukraine can use them. They need to increase defense spending in a time when they're faced with perhaps a recession coming. They've also done some other things that have hurt themselves. They've exposed their arms to the Russians. The Russians have become accustomed to strategies to use against their armaments. So initially you could see that in the beginning of the Ukrainian and Russian war, you could see that the Ukrainian use of missiles, such as the Patriot system, such as the Scout missile from France, Storm Shadow from England, the ATACMS from the United States, initially they were very effective. But then Russia became accustomed on how to deal with them. They've learned how to disable them and to minimize their effectiveness. So now you have a Russia that not only is well armed and has a large army, but also they have counter capability against our armaments. So this thing about the Russian and China unification of interest, they do have some agreements that they have together, and I'm not sure how well that they would honor them, but there's definitely an interest of them supporting each other because they view it as, well, if Russia could be treated this way, then China could too, and perhaps Taiwan becomes an issue for China with the United States. And one of the reasons why this has happened also is that in Europe, Western Europe, I don't believe they really care about China as a second front. How will that affect them? They're not the Pacific. They're far removed from anything occurring in the Pacific. However, it does affect the United States. And it also affects them a number of ways. They have to be concerned about Russia assisting China. They also have to be concerned about a possible second front, assuming that the first front is Ukraine, and the capability of going against two superpowers at the same time. Now, none of this happened yesterday. The seeds of the Iranian war, they were planted back in the 1970s, back in the United States, Jimmy Carter administration, where we saw the fall of the Shah of Iran. And say what you want about the Shah, and I know in many cases it's beyond the memory of people listening, but he was not someone who seemed like he wished to expand his empire. But he did not have the same vehement hatred for the West that the Iranians have. And I'm no fan of the Iranian government. A couple of their famous phrases and their most popular phrases is death to Israel and death to America. So I'm no fan here. But the seeds of this turmoil started back in the 70s. Also with the Ukrainian war. The civil war between Ukraine started in 2014 after the coup in Ukraine that occurred. It was sponsored by the West. Also, this war could have been stopped back in 2022 easily. As a matter of fact, Ukrainians and the Russians were close to an agreement. I think everyone knows the history. You have Boris Johnson from UK going to Kiev and saying, no, scrap that agreement that you have with Russia, and we're going to arm you and protect you. And I think that was the beginning of the flow of funds to the Ukrainian government, where the Ukrainian government is pretty much bought and paid for. So you look at them as a puppet government. And recently, a couple representatives in the United States, both Marco Rubio, who's head of the Department of State, and also General Kellogg, who was leading the negotiations for peace, they both referred to it as a proxy war, where Ukraine is a proxy of whom? Of the United States and of Western Europe. In other words, of NATO. Now, not everyone in NATO wishes to have this war. As a matter of fact, I believe in most countries, the populace do not want this war, including the United States, including the French, including, say, the Polish is a great example. But the war, in any way, the war continues regardless. And it's very ironic because we have these nations that are more concerned with protecting the borders of Ukraine than their own borders. We have one of the beaters of the war drums in the UK, Starmer. He's beating this war drum to protect the border in Ukraine, but he can't protect the English Channel from migrants. The same in France, exact same thing in France. With Macron, he has to be one of the most unpopular government officials to ever be in France. And he's beating the war drum to protect the border in Ukraine. He cannot even protect the Riviera. And in Germany, you have Merz, another one. He's emerged as a neocon who is all for the war against Russia. And he cannot protect, in Germany, anything at all. So what do we need here? How do we get out of this war situation? Well, the war between Ukraine and Russia can very easily be stopped. The United States just stopped supplying Ukraine with weapons and money. And I believe that even though the Western European nations that I mentioned are not on board with that they wish to continue the war, and they wish to continue the war for the reasons that I mentioned. They wish to have this faux enemy that's out there that they can unite themselves together with. If they do not have this enemy, even though I believe it to be a fictitious enemy, if they do not have this enemy, then I believe they will just fall apart. We'll start seeing nations leave the EU to reconsider their position in NATO, perhaps, but I think more fundamentally they have problems with the EU, because the EU started out as an economic union, and it's become a lot more than just economic. So it takes a strong man to reverse course. The course that's been set by the previous administration, which has done many things that were wrong, both internationally and domestically. But in this situation, you're also against those who are your allies, or should be your allies. But we have to remember that these governments, Steinmeier, Macron, Merz, they're all puppet governments. Even the Germans, they're toying with the idea of banning the opposition party, because the opposition party is an opposition party that would represent more clearly the will of the people and not the globalist in Germany. So how can you say that? Just stop funding Ukraine. How can you say that Russia is a faux enemy? Well, let's take a look at it. So there's tremendous amount of propaganda in Europe and the United States about Russia being a tremendous enemy against the United States. Specifically, the embodiment of this hatred is against Putin. So let's take a look at what Putin has actually done. Has Putin invaded any nation in NATO or the EU? No. His invasions that occurred in Ukraine happened after the coup in Ukraine, coup that was started by NATO. And it was his reaction to it. Now you have to remember, in Ukraine is not just Ukrainians, but people who are ethnic Russians. So everywhere now that's contested exist ethnic Russians. And these ethnic Russians in this Ukrainian civil war, they were under attack. It's as simple as that. The Crimean excursion, the Crimean War, it wasn't really a war. The invasion of Crimea by Russia was also during the Obama administration, and it was a reaction. It was a reaction to this coup, because in Crimea, again, they are Russian speakers, ethnic Russians. And Ukrainians were doing things like they were turning off the water supply going from mainland Ukraine into the Crimea. So this was a reaction that the Russians had. And it's an understandable one. And it's one that they didn't want. Even lately, in 2022, it seemed like they were holding off, wishing not to engage in this war. What else did Putin do wrong? Did Putin have 100,000 or hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrants flood into Russia? No. That was done by nations of the West against their populations. Does Putin arrest people for social media posts? No. That's done by Starmer in the UK. Did the Russians or Putin, did he hand over the Russian government to unelected bureaucrats somewhere else where they could be dictated to? No. That has happened in the EU. So if you want a bad guy, I would look a lot closer than all the way in Russia. These people that I mentioned, the Biden administration, Starmer, Macron, Merz, they are really the bad guys in this sad story. The other thing I'd like to point out is that the flames of war that are being fanned is very irrational. I mentioned previously that a nuclear war cannot be won. And when you're toying with a nation that does have the capability of striking back using nuclear weapons is extremely dangerous. And one thing I've noticed in this whole Ukrainian-Russian war, and with all the different provocations that have occurred, is that the younger populations, younger generations, they don't respect the effects of a nuclear war as much as the older generations. So I'm going to age myself and say one of my earliest memories, if not the earliest memory of anything newsworthy, was the Cuban Missile Crisis that we had in the United States. And back then, you're talking about early 60s. So back then, it was not that far away from World War II and the first use, and hopefully the last use, of nuclear weapons against the population, which occurred in Japan. And the results of that were still very fresh in the memory of people living then. And people were scared during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I was very young, very, very young. So I didn't know anything about the Cuban Missile Crisis and what it meant, but I knew people were scared. And I remembered that. Today, I think people don't realize that the nuclear weapons today are much more sophisticated. They are extremely much more powerful than in World War II. There's no winners. There's no capability of knocking out either the nuclear capability of another in a first strike situation, except perhaps of a large superpower against a smaller nation, but definitely not between two superpowers. That capability does not exist, nor can the missiles be stopped. So if anyone has those ideas are objectively false. And what this means is that there's no winners. There's no survivors. Well, there will be survivors, but there'll be survivors who wish that they did not survive. Also today, besides the nuclear weapons being more powerful, as I said, much, much more powerful, our societies are much more fragile. They're much more dependent upon electronics. Back in the 50s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, that was not the case. When someone went to work, they went to work physically. They were there to work. They didn't sign on to work. They didn't look at their app to see what the latest news is. That is not what occurred. There's no email. No, there's no phones except landlines. In the case of a nuclear attack back then, the landlines would be gone. But today, we would lose a lot more. There's so much dependent. There's so much that is dependent upon the internet. All of that would be gone. So I'd like to end by saying this video, this program, is going to be somewhat controversial, and I don't usually ask, but I do ask today that if you wish to have this video heard by others, it's going to be important for you to share it by any means that you have at your disposal. So I want to end by thanking everyone for watching, and God bless.